This is episode 456 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Fred Nathan. He is the president and I believe CEO and founder of Think New Mexico, which describes itself as a results-oriented think tank serving New Mexicans. Welcome back to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Fred.
Paul, thank you for having me back.
Hey, well, I really want to talk a little bit about this education report, but folks who may have missed it on election night, while Republicans and conservatives across the state had a really bad night, we had some fun up in Santa Fe on KSFR doing election returns, and something we've kind of become their go-to people up there, talking elections and watching the returns come in. So it was good to see you and do that together. And we're going to be in a very blue state, at least for the next 2 years, and we're going to have some challenges on our hands, certainly from the conservative side of things. But this education report seems to be a good contribution and something that can maybe move the needle here in New Mexico in education reform.
Thank you. We hope so.
Yeah, and I'm going to hold it up real quick. Hopefully the camera can get that. But so it's a detailed report, and you've got links for people on the website, thinknewmexico.org. You can get a copy yourself, mailed, or just a PDF. But what was kind of your overall organizational thought process in terms of getting into the education market? I mean, we have done education at the Rio Grande Foundation. For some years, it's been a challenge to get anything viable in terms of real reform in the roundhouse. But why now at Think New Mexico?
It's a great question. In terms of why now, there's two things. There's Mississippi, which I'll come back to. But one thing that struck us when we were thinking about what this year's topic would be is that you have now 5 rankings of the states on education quality that all put us last. And they all use slightly different criteria to come to their conclusion. So you've got Education Week, you've got Forbes, you've got Wallet Hub, U.S. News and World Report, and Kids Count. They all use different criteria, but they all agree that New Mexico is last. So we thought, this, and the report really doesn't go into that. We're just trying to look forward and not play the blame game, but we really sort of have hit the bottom. And so we thought, this is a little bit of a departure from what we usually do. We usually work on one discrete topic, like repealing the tax on Social Security or predatory lending or the food tax, repealing that. This time we thought, let's be a little more ambitious and let's cast around the country and the world for that matter, and also New Mexico, for what works and what would move the needle in terms of student outcomes. And that led us to Mississippi, of all places. And as you know, Paul, we used to say in New Mexico, thank God for Mississippi, because they were always 50th and we were 49th. But that really hasn't been the case for the last dozen years. We're policy wonks, so we monitor this stuff, but Mississippi has been slowly creeping up to the middle of the pack. They're now 29th in 4th grade reading and 23rd in 4th grade math. And this has been going on for, like I said, a dozen years. And it seems to have coincided with the appointment of a woman named Carrie Wright, who is the superintendent of schools in Mississippi. And she did a basic thing, which is she looked around and basically decided to focus on several factors and did it in a very apolitical way. And so when we looked at the progress that Mississippi had made, we thought, well, New Mexico could do the same thing. We have many of the same challenges in terms of poverty and so forth. If Mississippi can do this, we can do this as well. And in the end, we ended up being, I think, a lot more ambitious than Carrie Wright, because when we surveyed the literature and what other states and countries were doing, there were a lot of good ideas out there. I'm not sure we focused on 10 planks with about 30 legislative recommendations. I'm not at all convinced that we picked the ones that maybe would move the needle the most, but we did try to tailor it to New Mexico and really hone in on what was holding us back, whether it was school boards or whatever. And so anyway, that's a long answer to your question, Paul, but that's how this report came about.
Yeah, and we've been looking at Mississippi as well, and there's past podcasts that we've done with folks down in Mississippi. Your report came out shortly before the 2022 edition of the NAEP Index, which is the nation's report card, probably the single most credible tool for analyzing educational outcomes. And I know you've got the 2019 edition in your report on page 7. But the results, obviously we're now in a post, or at least a COVID world, where students lost the better part of a year in the classroom here in New Mexico, and New Mexico's results in particular were devastating. Now, we never achieved a high result in NAEP, but 4th grade, 8th grade reading and math, everything dropped to the bottom in New Mexico. And Mississippi didn't dropped off a little bit, but they didn't drop off that much. And it just seems like that comparison with Mississippi is a really important comparison that you make. Now, my question to you is, because you talk about Mississippi, but you don't really go into as much detail about what Mississippi actually did. My assessment, in talking to people down there, is that they broadly followed what Susana Martinez tried to do in her educational program. You could have written a very fancy report and just basically said, do what Mississippi did. Now, that might not fill up the 30 or 40 pages you have here, but
right.
Why didn't you write that report is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We did sort of depart, and we didn't try to just copy what Mississippi did. One thing, though, that we took out of Mississippi is it's just important to have a plan. And the Albuquerque Journal, said something that's just stuck with me, which is, if you don't have a plan, it's easy to get lost. And there's so many good reforms out there that we can be doing. Like I said, we focused on 10, but we could have easily done 20. And I feel the same way about Mississippi. What was important is that she came up with a plan, and then she stuck to it. She executed on the plan. And so we found that was important. And candidly, and I know you're going to bring this up, but one of the things that Mississippi did that Susana Martinez, in retrospect, she was probably right about, which is they hold back kids in 3rd grade who are not reading at grade level. And, to be candid, if we had put that in this report, I think there are a lot of policymakers that would have dismissed this and say, well, they're just recycling these ideas. So we sort of stayed away from that. Instead of that, we proposed that elementary students should have at least an hour more of instructional time than they currently get. And Paul, I want to get into that in some detail if we can, because I think it's sort of shocking how little instructional time kids are receiving in New Mexico. And what we're saying is, if you give kids or schools the latitude to have an additional hour of instruction, many of them could just devote it to reading and literacy, so that when kids reach 3rd grade, you don't have this awful dilemma of, do we leave this kid back, or do we socially promote them, which we know will just, make it so they eventually will drop out. So there's no good solution there, but probably the best thing we can do in New Mexico is give these kids more instructional time on the front end, so we don't have that that horrible dilemma when they reach third grade and they're still not reading. And for those of you that are watching this who are not policy wonks, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if kids aren't reading by third grade, that it gets pretty much hopeless after that, and that they're just destined to drop out. And so that's sort of a key milestone. And we're just trying to move that up earlier and say, let's make it so that they're reading by first grade or second grade, and we don't have to make this decision about whether to promote them or hold them back.
Yeah, and definitely let's talk about more education time. This is, broadly speaking, the first point in your paper, and one of the components is really to increase instructional time for kids throughout elementary, middle, and high school. The other involves adjusting the schedule so that it is not so summer break centric, and it's more of breaks worked in through the year. You call it the balanced schedule. So why don't we address both of those items? Because quite frankly, those are two that give me more heartburn than a lot of the other 10 points you have in your report.
Okay, so currently under state law, elementary students are given 5.5 hours of instructional time for a 180-day calendar. But wisely, the legislature makes it so that it's based on instructional hours. So some school districts can tailor it to their own needs. Some school districts do 4-day weeks, others do 5. But the problem is, if you read the statute, we count as instructional time parent-teacher conferences where the kids aren't present. So that's really not instructional time. There's a program called early release. It sounds like prison, but it's actually schooling. Mm-hmm. And a lot of elementary schools in New Mexico will shut down at noon on a Friday or Wednesday, and the teachers will just have meetings where the students aren't present, but that's counted as instructional time. If a teacher goes to get professional development, that's again considered instructional time, but the student's not there. So our students are getting, our best guess is a little bit less than 5 hours a day, and that's simply not sufficient. But more importantly, there are many studies, and there's one, I'm forgetting their names right now, but an economist from Stanford and an economist from Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania looked at 21 different reforms and tried to quantify them. And the one that was easily the best in terms of moving the needle was time on task. And here's where I think New Mexico might be the weakest, which is that we have all these rules that mitigate against giving kids enough instructional time. And, we can go all the way back to A Nation at Risk, where this was done during the Reagan administration, not a partisan report, Democrats and Republicans. And they looked around the world and said, the time that our kids get in school is significantly less than these other countries that seem to be outperforming us on lots of different metrics. And they proposed increasing instructional time. It was essentially ignored, but I think it's one of those things that's gotten more credibility with time. And we think it's time in New Mexico that we require more instructional hours, not just for elementary school students. We'd also do the same for middle and high school students, but not as much as elementary, where it's really needed. So and the balanced calendar, you want to?
Well, part of the, just correct me if I'm wrong, part of the issue is a lot of the teacher conferences, professional development, early release, all that is taken out of the number of hours that the kids are required to be in the classroom. Correct. And, I think that is definitely a fair issue. I'm not young enough to remember, and even though I went to Catholic schools, parochial schools growing up, it just strikes me as in all classrooms, there's a lot of time wasted Now, some of that time that's wasted in traditional public schools, that's not wasted in maybe Catholic schools, is due to disciplinary challenges and issues. Um, I just wanted to ask any thoughts on those kinds of things, and whether you think that's something that is worth looking more deeply at before you go into kind of extending the classroom year. Because I just remember when I was a kid, when I was in school, the last thing I wanted to do was spend even more time in the classroom, where I felt, quite frankly, a lot of time was wasted. Is there a way to address that in your research?
That's a very fair criticism, Paul. It's also about the quality of time, not just the quantity. And that's why in the report, we then moved to what can we do to increase teacher quality, right? Because if they're spending more time and it's not quality time, as you're pointing out, then you really haven't accomplished very much. And so that led easily into what can we do to increase the quality of teaching. And that's where we came across this idea of teacher residencies. And
Right.
this will sound like self-promotion, but we just hired the 2020 New Mexico Teacher of the Year to be our new education reform director, who's going to be leading this effort. Her name's Mandy Torres. And Mandy, interestingly, for her undergraduate degree in education, was required to do a one-year residency. And then she went into a school district back east where she was also required to do a one-year residency. So before she ever got her own class, she had 2 years of mentoring by expert teachers. And lo and behold, 10 years later, she's Teacher of the Year in New Mexico. So this is a reform that we think holds a lot of promise and is something that we need to be doing more of. The legislature, to their credit, they've started a pilot program. We'd like to see this made available to every new teacher because, as you know, Paul, there's going to be this competition that's already started between the states because there's this massive teacher shortage in the country. And one of the research findings is that teachers that have these residencies remain in the profession almost twice as long as those teachers that don't have a residency. And it's particularly important in New Mexico because so our teachers come basically from two different places. There are those that come out of the colleges of education. There's 8 of those in New Mexico. That enrollment is like falling off a cliff right now. And for the first time ever, the majority of our new teachers are people who have an alternative license. And in many cases, like I have a friend who just went through this process, actually took a 90% pay cut to work at a charter school with an alternative license. And we went out to lunch and I just talked to him about his experience. And he said, the most jarring thing is once he had the license, he was just dropped in a classroom to teach high school math. And there was no support. He was just, sink or swim. And he thought it would be wonderful to have had a year where he could have been mentored before he was dropped into the classroom. So that's a long answer to your question to say that I agree with you, Paul, that time on task by itself isn't enough. It has to be paired with other reforms that ensure that instructional time has a quality component.
Yeah, and just to kind of reinforce, I think the residency and a lot of that training is one of the strongest aspects of your report. I think the whole thing is good and very much worthwhile, but I've read a lot of data showing that indicating that training teachers how to teach, whether they're alternatively licensed or not, and you get into the schools of education a bit later in the report, and I want to talk to you about that, but that is really critical stuff, kind of learning from those who are already doing a good job. But I do want to talk about balanced school year.
Sure.
Obviously, summer learning loss is a thing. We know it's a real thing. Just speaking again from more personal experience, I was able to work and save money for college and for the future during the summer through summer jobs. And I'm a big proponent of young people working. I know that's not necessarily always the case with young people, especially nowadays, but that balanced schedule could have some impact there. So talk to me about the pros and cons through your own eyes of the balanced schedule.
Sure. So it does start that one of the biggest problems with the way we deliver education now is this traditional long summer of 12 weeks off. And if you talk to teachers in September, say, and you ask them what they're teaching, oftentimes they'll say, what my students forgot from April and May. And this is, of course, the summer learning loss. And so what about 4% of schools nationally now do, and I was surprised it was that high, they've moved to something that's generically called the balanced calendar. They compress the summer vacation from 12 weeks to 6 weeks generally. And then they take those 6 weeks and they redistribute them around the rest of the year so that you sort of have 9 weeks on of learning and 2 weeks off. And one of the other benefits of the balanced calendar is, and we heard this from a lot of teachers, that it's the period from when school starts in New Mexico, which is, say, mid-August, that you essentially go from mid-August to Thanksgiving without a real break. And they say, there's a lot of teacher burnout that occurs then, and it's not easy on the students either. So 2 school districts, remarkably in New Mexico, and unfortunately we don't have the longitudinal data, have moved to balanced calendars in the last 2 years. One is Las Cruces, which is, I think, our second largest district, and the other is Truth or Consequences. So they've both made this transition with leadership from their superintendents. I think Truth or Consequences is the one that's been doing it for 2 years. And they have a very charismatic superintendent who said, let's try this. There was a lot of opposition from teachers, and this is anecdotal, but Chanel Segura, who was the superintendent that implemented this, said that a lot of teachers came up to her after they went through it for a year and said, I was opposed to it, but I now see the wisdom in doing this, particularly those 2 factors, the less learning loss in the summer, and then having a break in the fall so that they weren't completely exhausted by the time they got to Thanksgiving. You've identified the single, I think, best reason not to do this, which is, you're right, there are a lot of students who get fairly well-paying summer jobs during that 12-week period, and they need that income. You could argue that they could get part-time work in those 2-week breaks, whether it's scooping ice cream or what have you, waiting tables at a restaurant. It doesn't need to be compacted. So you're getting the same amount of time off. You're just sort of spreading it out. And I haven't studied it enough to know whether those students could get the same pay and the same jobs if it was broken up 6 weeks and then 3 2-week vacations scattered throughout the school year. So there is that consideration.
Yeah, no, that's very reasonable. And, I know some districts are moving in that direction, and hopefully we can get some, like you said, longitudinal studies to really kind of analyze how this makes a difference. And, in a more choice-driven environment, which I would like to see, you might have the ability for families to make those choices. And maybe there could be, I know districts, the tendency would be all this district goes to one model, and
right.
That one size fits all thing really gets to me a little bit here when it comes to education. So I know we're going to have to talk a little bit more expeditiously here about some of the other things, but improving teacher training, give me, aside from what you've already mentioned, what is 1 or 2 quick points about that?
Two
Go ahead.
Points, and it's sort of inside baseball, but we talked to a lot of rank and file teachers, and one thing we heard over and over again is that at the colleges of education in New Mexico, many times the professors haven't actually taught in a elementary school, middle school, high school themselves, and that a lot of the teachers felt that what they were learning was very theoretical and abstract. And of course, they wanted to learn practical skills and training that they could use in their classroom. So there's a whole section about what needs to be done about the colleges of education. But one example of this is there's this new pedagogy called the science of reading. And it wasn't taught for many years at the colleges of education. The legislature began to hear that other states were using it with a lot of success. Mississippi uses it. And so they're now mandating that elementary school teachers that didn't receive that training, which is basically everyone, they have to take that training on top of their professional development. And a lot of teachers said to us, why wasn't the science of reading, which has been, done in other states for 20 years, why are we so late to the game in that? So this is, an example of going into the colleges of education and taking a closer look at what they're teaching and how that impacts students in the classroom. And I think there needs to be a lot of work done there. And the policymakers that we've talked to have said that's also an issue that's on their radar and something that needs to be worked through.
And that kind of dovetails with the colleges of education and, what they teach in those schools. Now, I don't want to, this isn't in your report, but, I get the impression that there's a lot of left-wing kind of social cultural approaches to education that get taught in those colleges. But what is your take on, again, one or two highlights of what you would like to see changed in the colleges of education in New Mexico?
Well, if I could wave a magic wand, I think I would only have them hiring people that have practical experience teaching in elementary school, middle schools, high schools, and not as much emphasis on research and theory. I think this is why you see the enrollment of these schools is going down so dramatically, and more. I think about 55% of our new teachers last year got alternative licenses. So I would actually start with who are we hiring to teach, and then taking a very hard look at the curriculum to make sure that it's evidence-based and it's things like the science of reading as opposed to whatever they've been teaching for 40 years, which maybe hasn't been as effective as some of these new strategies that other states have adopted. So there needs to be really, frankly, an overhaul of the colleges of education. And the most, obvious thing here is that students are now voting with their feet and going for alternative licensure instead of attending these schools. So I think this is a good time for these schools to really take a hard look at who they're hiring and what they're teaching.
All right. Principal pay and training. Certainly, we want good principals in our schools. Paying them more can help, but paying them more and training them better seems to be where the sweet spot would be, and that's what you want in this report. So talk about principals.
So one fascinating thing, I was talking about how the calendar leads to improving the quality of teachers. Another thing that attracts teachers, it turns out, is really good principals. There was, I think the Gates Foundation did a study as to what's important to teachers. And the head of teacher pay was a principal who they really admire and respect. Unfortunately, in New Mexico, we really pay our principals very poorly relative to teachers and to central office administrators. This is, it's astonishing, but in some schools, you have level 3 teachers who are paid higher at a higher rate than the principal. Now, the principal, like take APS, you're under contract, you have to work 250 days a year. Teachers, 190 days. So it's hard, the state is finding it's very hard to attract people to become principals. And then you look at their pay relative to some of these central office administrators who have so much less responsibility. I mean, you would never run a business this way and have a whole, your critical frontline workers paid so poorly compared to people who don't interact with your customer base at all. So we think, frankly, the central office administrators, when you look at their pay scale, it seems high in terms of what they do as it relates to the students in the classroom. On the other hand, principals, absolutely critical for teaching and learning, probably because they're the ones hiring the teachers. And this is what leads to also some recommendations about their training. Right now, their licensure doesn't really require that they know very much, if anything, about instruction or curriculum. Their license is the same that a central office administrator would get. And that training is all about budget issues, legal issues, not something that you really delve into as a principal. So we would rethink their training. And also, once again, if you look around the country, a lot of states are doing these mentorships for principals, these residencies, just like we talked earlier about teachers. And sure enough, principals with that kind of training remain as principals much longer. So here again, we think we need to totally rethink our practices in terms of how we pay principals relative to other positions within the education ecosystem and their training.
All right. So, well, that's good. Yeah, we'll have to move on. Upgrading school board quality. Now, a lot of this just has to do with limiting political contributions and nepotism and those kinds of things. And, here in Albuquerque, and I'm sure in Santa Fe, you have plenty of people that want to run for school board, but that gets a lot trickier in some of these rural districts. My main concern here is just, are you making it unlikely that you're going to have enough school board members with the various new rules and regulations that you want to implement so they increase the quality of those school board members?
Yeah, so we actually think that the caliber of school board members, let me go back. This is anecdotal. I have a friend who grew up in a small town in Indiana. And he said, in this town where he grew up, the greatest thing you could do with your life is to serve on the school board. And people would give their right arm. And it was the most respected and admired people in their community that ended up getting elected and serving on the school board. And his point, he lives in Santa Fe, was if you create a culture like this, it perpetuates itself. We frankly don't have that in many districts in New Mexico. So let's take Santa Fe, for example. Too often, the people that run for the school board are using it as a stepping stone because they want to get involved in politics and run for another office. And I live in Santa Fe, and in 2017, I think, we had 3 of our 5 school board members running for different offices. One member got elected 7 months later, announced for mayor. Another one got elected to the legislature. She then resigned, and her replacement within 2 months announced that he was running for the county commission. Needless to say, they struggled to get a quorum. And so one of our proposals is, if you run for another office as a school board member, you can't hold on to that office. You automatically resign from the school board as soon as you file your papers for whatever office you're running for. And it's hard to be on a school board. It's a lot of responsibility, and those people really need to be on the job full time. There's a big problem, unfortunately, with nepotism, and your viewers and listeners, Paul, if they type in nepotism and school boards in Santa Fe, up pops lots of examples, which we cite in the report. And we were surprised there were so many cases of nepotism. And then when we looked at the statute, we discovered there's actually no penalty for nepotism and school boards, hiring your children or your brother or sister. And so that's a simple fix. Another one is lots of instances where people run for the school board because there's so much patronage and contracts to be given out. And in New Mexico, you have to disclose your political contributors if you're running for the school board, if you're in a school district that has 12,000 students or more. Well, that's only 5 of the 89 districts. But yet even the smallest districts, Roy, for example, Roy, New Mexico, they still have millions of dollars in contracts to distribute. So we think all of that should be distributed. But maybe the most important thing, again, to turn around the culture of school boards is in current statute, school board members only are required to have 5 hours of training. But really, to be a good school board member, you need to know about many different things, not just the financial things with budgeting, legal issues, but what can you do as school board members to increase student achievement? These are things that school board members often don't get any training in. So we'd like to increase the training from about 5 hours to 24 hours, which still isn't probably enough to cover the entire waterfront. But to your question, Paul, I think if you raise the caliber, first of all, if you deter the people that run for the school board because they want to run for higher office, or because they want to get their children a job or relatives, or they want to dole out contracts, if you deter those people, you raise the caliber of the school board, and maybe you change the culture and can attract people that are more interested in serving students and being servant leaders than what we sometimes get on our school boards.
All right, Fred, we're going to have to go into the lightning round here because we're running out of time here. So benefits of charter schools.
By the way, Paul, you could always have me back and we could do this for another 45 minutes. But
I know that would be fun, but
that would be my first choice.
So benefits of charter schools. We at the Rio Grande Foundation love charter schools and support them. And I think, getting more of them deployed across our state, including rural areas, would be excellent. Relevant and rigorous curriculum. Now, this has a lot of benefits to it, but one kind of concern might be that you wind up overdoing it and kids drop out, young people drop out who are unable to do traditional curriculum. They could do vocational school or something like that. Like, I guess that's my real question here. It's not how tough should things be, it's what options should there be available for students who may not be on the college track. And the briefer the better.
Yeah, so we're big proponents of CTE. So for example, right now, there's no CTE required of any students. And we would require 2 CTE courses for all students, not just those who don't want to go to college, but actually we cite a study that shows that school districts that require 2 CTE courses, high quality, their graduation rates are over 90%. And this goes to the issue of relevancy. When you poll kids that drop out from high school, this is a national poll that I'm referring to, many times it's because they found what they were being taught wasn't relevant. So we would require 2 CTE courses. If you look at private schools in New Mexico, independent schools like Albuquerque Academy, Santa Fe Prep, they require internships in your senior year that are not academic in nature. You go and work in a hospital, you go and work as a paralegal in a law firm. So we think that's very valuable. We also think, and this would be considered making the curriculum more rigorous, but again, so important. We would require 2 foreign language requirements. Right now, nothing is required there. Yet 49 of the 50 flagship universities in this country require at least two foreign language requirements in order to graduate. And let's say you're a student who doesn't want to go into college. About 60% of jobs now that don't require a college degree, you're advantaged if you speak another language. So again, this is an example where, yes, we would make the curriculum more rigorous and relevant, but we think it would be advantageous to these students. Also, financial literacy should be taught. 30 states now teach financial literacy. It's not required in New Mexico. Civics, not required in New Mexico. These are things that are both relevant and would be more rigorous, but and would lead to higher graduation rates than what we're doing right now.
Okay, and now we are up against it, but right sizing, smaller districts, this is relevant across the state, but what we're really talking about here is APS, and that's shrinking the size. I know you talk about school size, and that's a relevant part of this as well. And we're in lockstep with you on smaller schools. We could talk and argue about classes, but let's talk about APS. That briefly, I know as much as possible. How would we get APS shrunk to some reasonable size? I mean, do you think that's really realistic given
Yes.
Where things are? Okay, great.
So APS used to be about 90,000 students. We're now at about 72,000. So again, families voting with their feet to leave the district.
Shrinking the old-fashioned way by people just leaving.
Right. And, the biggest argument against doing this, well, let me back up. William Ucci, professor of business, UCLA, did some really path-breaking research looking at the optimal size of school districts. And he points out that looking across the country, that when school districts hit about 15,000 students, they hit a point of diminishing returns in terms of student outcomes. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because when we look at the smallest districts, we go to the opposite end of the scale. Those are our highest performing districts in New Mexico. If you look at our top 15, 13 are very small districts, and then you have Rio Rancho and Los Alamos. Rio Rancho spun off of APS about 20 years ago. At the time, the APS school board said this will be a disaster. They don't have the property tax base. It will never work. It's now one of our highest performing districts, which sort of proves William Ucci's point. The question is, with 72,000 students, if you were to break those up into, say, 6 districts so you could get under that 15,000 student threshold, how would you do the property taxes so that you wouldn't have a school district that would be, would have a hard time operating? And there's a very simple solution to this, which is you would take the property tax base for all of APS, and then the money would follow the student. So it wouldn't matter what neighborhood your student is in, they would get the same, whether in the South Valley or the Northeast Heights or the North Valley or the Southeast quadrant of Albuquerque. And really what we should do is we should do it around clusters of schools, elementary schools that lead into middle schools that lead into a high school or 2 high schools. And that would be much more manageable. If you look at why, and I don't want to criticize anybody on the APS school board. I appreciate what those people are trying to do. I appreciate what Scott Elder is trying to do as the superintendent. But I would argue 174 schools is simply unmanageable for 5 volunteer school board members. And this would make so much more sense to split this up by clusters into more manageable, smaller districts.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. A very informational report. If you're interested, again, thinknewmexico.org. You can read it there as a PDF or request a copy. And the folks at Think New Mexico are kind enough to send one out to you via old-fashioned snail mail. So
absolutely.
Thanks again, Fred. And we'll be seeing you around Santa Fe in January. Really appreciate your time and the work you guys put into this report.
Many thanks, Paul, and thanks again for having me back.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point, New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.